Veronica Boza looked out the window of the music studio and then down at her iPhone. As she tapped the icon that would show her the weather forecast, the 39-year-old Nashville, Tennessee music producer hoped that tomorrow would be as clear and warm as today had been. Nashville's weather was usually predictable, but it was August of 2010, and just 3 months before, the city had been slammed by the worst flood in its history. Ever since then, Veronica had stopped taking for granted that every summer day would be hot and humid, and like so many other Nashville residents, she checked the weather report regularly now in case there were any other extreme weather events in the forecast. At the reassuring sight of a tiny yellow sun displayed on her smartphone screen, along with a predicted high for the following day of 92 degrees Fahrenheit, Veronica smiled. She and her 9-year-old son, Jordan, had already decided that if Saturday's weather was sunny and hot, they were going to spend all day at the community pool in their new neighborhood. After putting her phone away, Veronica gathered her things and began getting ready to leave the studio and head for home where Jordan was waiting for her. But on Veronica's way out the door, one of her coworkers reached out and put a hand on Veronica's arm. As Veronica stopped and looked questioningly at her friend, the woman asked quietly, "Hey, Veronica, is everything okay?" Veronica smiled, her warm brown eyes almost as dark as her hair. She loved her job here in the city known as the music capital of the world, and she also loved the fact that she worked with such a tight-knit community of people who genuinely cared about each other's lives. It had not exactly been a secret that Veronica was going through a tough divorce and that Jordan, who sometimes accompanied his mother to work, had become a bit withdrawn and clingy as his parents worked out their personal and legal differences. But when it came to her divorce, at least at work, Veronica tried not to dwell on the pain and personal difficulties she'd been experiencing. But even though she wasn't necessarily sharing these feelings at work, the fact was that Veronica was feeling some anxiety. She and her husband Tim had been married for 15 years. They had met and fallen in love shortly after Veronica had immigrated to the US from Italy in 1994. They had both been in their mid-20s when they met, and they both had big dreams. Tim was a construction worker who had plans to build a home remodeling business. As for Veronica, she wanted to work in the entertainment industry. And for the first dozen years of their marriage, their life together in north central Tennessee had been good. Tim did build up his business, and while Veronica worked some part-time jobs, she also went back to school and earned a degree in communications. And 7 years after getting married, Tim and Veronica had their only child, their son Jordan, who was the apple of his mother's eye. It had taken Veronica's career a little longer than Tim's to take off, but when it did, and she got a job as a music producer in Nashville, Tennessee, where the Bozes lived, it seemed like the sky was the limit for her. Veronica, who was not only beautiful with her dark hair and features and olive skin, also had that it factor that just made people like her and want to be around her. She was also a devout Catholic who hardly ever missed a Sunday service at her local church. But despite having this celebrity-like style and charisma, Veronica was very modest and never tried to put herself in the spotlight. And in her career, this was literally the case. Her job was to work behind the scenes with recording artists to help them make new music. And in 2009, Veronica was so in demand as a producer that she was asked to produce that year's Country Music Television Awards, which was a very big challenge. But Veronica did a great job, which really elevated her amongst her peers. But as Veronica's star was on the rise, Tim's career was starting to falter. And then, starting in 2007, the construction industry was rocked by the Great Recession. That's when the U.S. housing market went from boom to bust, and large amounts of mortgage-backed investments suddenly lost value. And so around that time, Tim's construction and home remodeling business took a serious hit, putting a strain on the family. In addition to stress over their new financial problems, Veronica's job was becoming so demanding that she was working 10 to 14 hours every day. This while Tim suddenly found himself scrambling for any customers. By 2009, the pressure on the Bozos was just too much, and their marriage collapsed, and the couple filed for divorce. When they split, Veronica moved to an upscale neighborhood 30 minutes outside of Nashville, while Tim had to move back in with his mother. And even though both Tim and Veronica were in agreement on some things, they both loved Jordan and they both were ready to move on with new romantic relationships, the couple had reached an impasse while trying to negotiate a final settlement on child support and a custody arrangement. But finally, it seemed like those last two issues would be resolved, and that by September or early October of that year, the divorce would be final. So, when Veronica looked into her worried coworker's face that Friday afternoon as she was leaving work, Veronica just smiled at her friend and told her how much she appreciated her support, and she assured her that the whole divorce was going to be over soon and that everything would be okay. Her friend smiled back, relieved, and asked Veronica if she had any interesting weekend plans. And Veronica's face lit up as she told her friend that tomorrow she and her son were going to head to the pool for the day. A few minutes later, Veronica was settled into the driver's seat of her dark blue SUV. She reached into her purse, slipped on her sunglasses, and headed west, away from the noise and honky-tonk glamour of the city to Hermitage, a Nashville suburb named for its main landmark, the plantation where Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, had lived for more than 40 years. Her destination was a quiet, affluent neighborhood just 7 miles south of the famous plantation, a development called Bridgewater, where Veronica and Jordan lived in a 3-story pale brick colonial-style home with black shutters and a covered front porch supported by 6 white columns. Her 2-car garage was located in the back of the house, and she reached the garage by turning down a narrow dead-end street that ran parallel to the street in front of her house. As Veronica turned down that little dead-end road, she felt the same thrill she'd felt 4 months earlier when she'd bought the house. It was perfect for her and Jordan. Her neighbors were friendly but not intrusive, the wooden fence around her backyard gave her and Jordan plenty of privacy, and the whole place just felt very safe and secure. Veronica turned right into her driveway, and after parking her car in the garage, she headed inside to see her son Jordan. The next day, Saturday, went exactly to plan. Veronica and Jordan drove to the nearby community recreation center where the pools sparkled in the sunshine. As Veronica read and sunbathed, Jordan and the other kids splashed and played in the cool water. By the time they got home that afternoon, Jordan was tired and happy, and Veronica was tanned and rested. The next morning, Sunday, August 29th, Veronica bustled around the kitchen making breakfast for both of them. When they were finished eating, Veronica reminded her son to pack his overnight bag with anything special that he wanted to take to his dad's house. The plan that morning was that Veronica and Jordan would go to church, and then afterward, they would meet Jordan's father, Tim, in the parking lot, and he would take Jordan for the next couple of days. By 10 a.m., Veronica and Jordan were climbing into Veronica's car, and a minute later, they were on the road for the 20-minute drive to St. Edward's Church. On the drive, Veronica did her best to hide the stress she was already feeling about seeing Tim. She tried to think instead about her own plans for the afternoon. She and her new boyfriend, Brian, were going to visit Fall Creek Falls, a beautiful state park 2 hours southeast of Bridgewater. Veronica pictured the mountains and waterfalls, and by the time the church came into view, Veronica could feel herself relax, just a little. After parking the car, she and Jordan headed inside to their usual pew, where Veronica started glancing through the church bulletin and greeting other parishioners. After the service was over, Veronica and Jordan said their goodbyes to Father Breen. The elderly priest nodded encouragingly at Veronica. He knew that Tim and Veronica used the church parking lot as a place to exchange custody of Jordan, and he could feel Veronica tense as she stepped outside the church and spotted Tim's car in the lot. Although Tim and Veronica had initially agreed to a 50-50 custody arrangement, Jordan was actually spending substantially more time with his mother than with his father. While Veronica was more than okay with this, she did want her child support payments to Tim to be reduced, so they reflected the actual amount of time that Jordan was spending with his dad. But hopefully, their lawyers could work something out, and soon, because Veronica really, really wanted this marriage to be over. Taking a deep breath, Veronica slipped her hand into Jordan's, and the two of them walked away from the church down the sidewalk to the parking lot. A few minutes later, she and Jordan had reached Tim, and after exchanging only a few curt words with her estranged husband, Veronica gave Jordan a big hug and told him to have a great time with his dad and with his grandmother. Then Veronica turned around and headed back toward her car. As she walked, she looked up and saw Father Breen still standing in the doorway of the church. She waved and smiled at him, and he did the same back. When Veronica reached her car, she climbed inside, turned it on, and then began the 20-minute drive back home. She already missed her son, but she'd be seeing him in a few days. And in the meantime, she did get to have some alone time with Brian. Veronica and Brian were both music and TV producers, and when they'd met about 6 months earlier, the chemistry between them had been instant. And over the last several months, their feelings for each other had only deepened and grown stronger. As Veronica pulled into the Bridgewater neighborhood, she glanced at her watch. It was just after noon. She and Brian had already spoke on the phone earlier that day, and the plan was for him to meet her at her house around this time so they could head out to Falls Creek Falls. Veronica turned down the narrow dead-end street behind her house and then into her driveway. She opened her garage door, she drove inside, and was about to push the garage door remote again to close the garage door behind her when she paused. She had noticed something in her rearview mirror as soon as she pulled into the garage, and so to get a better look, she turned around in her seat and looked out her car's back window. And sure enough, there, outside, on her driveway, was something totally unusual that should not have been there. About 20 minutes later, at 12:30 p.m., the 911 dispatcher at the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department received a frantic call from a man who identified himself as Brian Robinson. He was standing inside the house belonging to his girlfriend, Veronica Boza, and Veronica was dead. No, he had not checked for a pulse. No, he had not tried to render any medical assistance. Please, he said, giving dispatch the address, just get here. By 12:50 p.m., police cars and medical personnel lined the quiet street in front of the stately pale brick colonial house with more vehicles and flashing lights parked out back in the driveway. The white pillared porch and perimeter of the house were soon cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape. Inside the house, veteran homicide detectives Johnny Crumby and Andrew Injachok stood in the spacious living room looking down at the ruined and mangled body of one of Nashville's rising stars. Veronica lay on her side on the living room floor. Spread out around her on the polished wooden floorboards was a pool of blood that had already started to darken and thicken at the edges. Veronica had been shot at close range at least 4 times. Even without an autopsy report, it was clear from the abrasions on Veronica's forearms, the open door of her car, and the spilled contents of her purse in the garage that Veronica had at first tried to outrun her attacker. But when that didn't work, she had most likely turned and stood her ground, attempting to fight her attacker off. The motive for this crime did not appear to be a robbery, since investigators quickly found money and checks in plain sight in the house, along with $300 in cash inside the kitchen pantry. But a quick check of Veronica's SUV, the garage, her purse pockets and tabletops, as well as drawers, did show that at least one important thing was missing, and that was Veronica's white iPhone. Meanwhile, the crime scene technicians had also found one important piece of physical evidence. At first glance, it had appeared to police that the killer had picked up all the shell casings from the bullets they fired into Veronica's body. But after moving aside the furniture in the living room, crime scene techs had found their first critical clue. Snugged up against the baseboard behind the white sofa was a single shell casing that the killer must have left behind in their rush to leave the house. Now, looking down at the grisly scene in front of them, even the seasoned detectives were shocked at the brutality of this crime. Although the murder rate in Nashville was almost twice the national average, very few of those homicides were ever committed in affluent neighborhoods like Bridgewater. On the other hand, as these detectives knew, Tennessee was a state that ranked in the top 5 in terms of domestic violence and domestic violence-related homicides. As crime scene technicians began moving through the house, dusting for fingerprints, taking pictures, and marking and bagging evidence, Detectives Crumby and Injachok headed for the back door. The first person they wanted to talk to was Veronica's boyfriend. Not only had Brian found Veronica's body, but his reaction to that discovery had raised some red flags for the detectives. While he had immediately called 911, it was only after the 911 dispatcher had told him to that he had even checked to see if Veronica was still alive. And after telling the dispatcher, no, Veronica had no pulse, Brian had ended the call and then immediately gone into the downstairs bathroom to wash his hands before stepping outside to wait for the police. As detectives stepped outside, they noticed that already Veronica's neighbors had begun to gather in stunned groups at the front and back of Veronica's house. Police knew it would not take long for a sense of fear and anxiety to overwhelm these families who, up until now, had felt so safe in this tranquil suburban haven with its sparkling pool and well-tended nature trails. Standing in the driveway, the detectives spotted Brian, whose apparent shock had now given way to grief. But despite his obvious distress, when the detectives asked Brian to accompany them to the police station for a formal interview, he immediately agreed to the request. Before leaving, the detectives went back inside the house to give instructions for investigators to start interviewing neighbors and putting together a timeline of when the crime had been committed. Investigators also needed to track down Veronica's coworkers and friends in case they had any information that would help police understand what was going on in Veronica's life that might have been a motive for her murder. And they also wanted police to search everywhere for Veronica's phone, along with any other electronic equipment like computers or tablets. Without access to the physical phone, the detectives wanted access as soon as possible to her cell phone records, which would show who she had spoken to that morning, and the records would show when her iPhone had been used last. 15 minutes later, the detectives and Brian walked into the nearby Hermitage police station. Once inside the interrogation room, the detectives did not waste any time. Detective Crumby pressed Brian about his whereabouts that morning and what he saw and did when he arrived at Veronica's house at 12:30 that afternoon. When Brian told them about a phone conversation he'd had with Veronica at about 11:50 a.m. as she was driving back from church, detectives exchanged a meaningful glance. If Brian's phone records confirmed that statement, they had just narrowed down the window of time during which Veronica had been killed to sometime between noon and 12:30 when Brian arrived at the house. That window would be narrowed even further when Veronica's cell records showed that Veronica had made a second call after she talked to Brian. She had called a friend, and this second conversation had ended at 12:08. So if Brian himself was not the killer, then Brian must have arrived on the scene literally just minutes after the killer had left. Hoping to clear his name, Brian tried to offer up any information he thought could be useful to their investigation. He said when he had arrived at Veronica's house, he immediately noticed that her garage door was open and she never left it open. Brian also told detectives that after making that call to Veronica at 11:50 a.m., he had stopped by a convenience store to buy some snacks for him and Veronica to enjoy on their outing they had planned for that afternoon, and he had left that store at 12:15, and he thought maybe the store had a surveillance camera that would back up his story and give him an alibi. As to why he did not try to offer any medical assistance to Veronica, Brian said that when he saw all the blood and bullet wounds, he just assumed that she was dead. And after talking with the dispatcher and checking for a pulse, Brian could not stand to have Veronica's blood all over his hands, so that was why he stepped into the bathroom to wash them. Brian then told police that the person they should be interviewing was Veronica's estranged husband, Tim. Brian told detectives that the couple was in the middle of a bitter dispute over money and custody arrangements, and so Tim would have a lot more reason to kill Veronica than he, Brian, would. Before letting Brian leave the station, police requested a DNA swab, fingerprints, and access to Brian's phone records, and Brian complied right away. While detectives did not have any evidence that would allow them to detain Brian, they also did not have any evidence that completely eliminated him as a suspect. After ending their interview with Brian, the detectives again moved quickly. They wanted to talk to the next person of interest on their possible suspect list. Hopping into their car, they headed north to tell Tim Boza that his wife had just been murdered. Tim answered their knock on the front door of his mother's house in Robertson County, a 35-minute drive from the church parking lot where Tim had picked up Jordan earlier that day. After hearing the news of Veronica's death, Tim seemed most upset not by the murder, but at the prospect of having to tell his 9-year-old son that his mother was now dead. After making plans to leave Jordan at his sister's house, Tim willingly accompanied the detectives to the police station for a formal interview. By 7 p.m. that night, he was sitting in a police interrogation room, answering pointed questions about his financial problems, how much money he stood to lose in the divorce, and the statements they'd heard about the couple's volatile relationship. Tim admitted that he and Veronica were not getting along, and that he was worried that Veronica was going to try to limit the time Tim could have custody of his son. Tim also told police that he had not wanted the divorce, suggesting that Veronica's long workdays and high-powered job had put as much strain on the marriage as Tim's money troubles had. Tim also suggested that his wife had been unfaithful. Detectives were surprised that Tim was speaking so openly about marital problems that could be seen as motives for murder, but when pressed by Detective Crumby, who told Tim, quote, "Something about you doesn't seem right," Tim pushed right back. He understood that police were only doing their job. He was the soon-to-be ex-husband, and they had to investigate his possible involvement, but he insisted that he had had nothing to do with the murder. He also told police that he could account for all of his movements that day, starting with the time he left the church parking lot at 11:45 a.m. with Jordan. Tim told detectives that after he had arrived home, he had left his son with his mother, so Jordan's grandmother, at the house, and then Tim had gone out to a home supply store to get the materials he needed to make a plumbing repair, and then he also made a stop at a local grocery store to buy some soda for Jordan. Tim produced time-stamped receipts and suggested that the police see if either store had surveillance cameras that could confirm where he was that day. Like Veronica's boyfriend, Brian, Tim also agreed to give police a DNA swab. He allowed them to take photographs of him and said it was perfectly fine if police wanted to examine his phone and confirm the list of calls Tim had made that day. That night, while waiting for the autopsy report and the crime lab's report on evidence collected at the crime scene, Detectives Crumby and Injachok started poring over the cell phone records they had obtained from the phones belonging to Tim, Brian, and Veronica. And that's when they noticed that there was one number that appeared dozens of times in Tim's phone records. It belonged to Tim's business partner, Coy Cotham, who went by the name Corey Cotham. Since Tim had already told the police that he had made several calls that day to Corey, it wasn't the identity of this caller that surprised the detectives. It was the number of calls back and forth between Corey and Tim, including 13 separate calls on the day of Veronica's murder and dozens of calls and text messages over the previous days and weeks. Intrigued, detectives ran a background check on Corey, and they were stunned to find out that he had 2 prior convictions for aggravated assault. The detectives finished work late that evening, feeling good about the progress they'd made so far. But by mid-morning the next day, so a day after Veronica was killed, August 30th, that sense of optimism had disappeared. The alibis for their 2 main suspects, Tim and Brian, had both come back rock solid. Surveillance footage would confirm that Tim was not anywhere near the crime scene when Veronica was murdered. And similarly, police were able to confirm that Brian had in fact left a convenience store at 12:15 p.m. and given that he called 911 at 12:30 p.m., just 15 minutes later, to report finding Veronica, that would not have left him enough time to commit the murder. Interviews with friends and neighbors had also failed to shine any light on what might have happened, especially with Tim and Brian in the clear. One neighbor had reported seeing a light-colored van or SUV on the road behind Veronica's house, but this neighbor could not identify the make or model, and he didn't get a license number, and he didn't get a good look at the driver. The shell casing that was found inside of Veronica's house, which turned out to be a match for the bullets recovered from the crime scene, it should be noted that all the bullets that had been fired at Veronica went through her, so they were able to find the bullets on the ground. That match was still an important clue, but only if they had a way to find out where the gun was now and who had used it. Suddenly, in the face of these disappointments, those phone records that the police were collecting and the name Corey Cotham had become the detectives' best and possibly only remaining leads. Convinced that a deeper analysis of data from the cell phones, along with the records of the calls, might generate new leads, the Metropolitan Nashville Police asked for help from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau agreed and assigned one of its experts in computer and mobile device forensics to the Veronica Bosa murder investigation. So, after turning over Tim's phone and all the phone records they had to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, Local investigators reached out to their new person of interest, Corey Cotham, and asked him for an interview, to which he agreed. But, like both Tim and Brian, Corey also had an alibi for the day of Veronica's murder. He told police he had spent the day at the home of a girlfriend in the Nashville area and that she could confirm this. As for any involvement in Veronica's murder, Corey said he had nothing to do with it. Unlike Tim and Brian, Corey refused to let police access his cell phone, which he said was locked inside of his vehicle. He also refused to give police a DNA swab. The detectives, who now wondered if maybe Corey had also been involved in some kind of a relationship with Veronica, responded by getting a search warrant that would allow them to impound Corey's car and examine everything inside of it, including his phone. They also got a warrant for a DNA swab and photographs of Corey. Detectives now had their suspicions about Corey, but no hard evidence that connected him to Veronica's murder. So Corey, like Tim and Brian, was allowed to leave. After searching Corey's car and retrieving his phone, detectives immediately turned it over to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and then the detectives turned their own attention to investigating Corey's alibi. Using the phone number Corey had given them, they contacted Corey's girlfriend in Nashville, Jenny Addington, who agreed to meet them in the parking lot of a shopping mall near her home. And then, once again, detectives hit a dead end. According to Jenny, she had worked an overnight shift on the night of August 28th, and then when she came home the next day at 7 a.m. on August 29th, so the day Veronica was killed, Corey was sleeping in her bedroom. And at the time of the murder, sometime between 12:08 and 12:40 p.m., Jenny was making lunch for Corey, who spent the day with her inside of her apartment. On September 5th, 6 days after Veronica's murder, Nashville's music community turned out in force to attend Veronica's funeral service. Also in attendance were Tim and Jordan, as well as Veronica's boyfriend, Brian, and police. But the only intel officers picked up was a rising murmur of concern and fear. What had really happened to Veronica? And could her murderer be right here in this church right now? It wouldn't be until 6 days after that funeral service that investigators would get a phone call that would finally give them the answers to those questions and would break the homicide case wide open. On Saturday, September 11th, exactly 2 weeks after Veronica's murder, Corey's Nashville girlfriend, Jenny, called the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department and asked to speak with Detectives Crumby and Injachok. She told the officer who had picked up her call that she had not been entirely truthful with the detectives when she had spoken to them last, and now she was terrified and she wanted to come into the police station and tell the detectives what she actually knew. Based on the new statement Jenny would make to detectives on September 11th, along with an analysis of cell phone data that would map out the actual physical location of Veronica's iPhone both before and after her murder, this is a reconstruction of what actually happened to her on the day she was killed. Sunday, August 29th was hot and humid, but inside of St. Edward's Catholic Church in Nashville, the air was cool, and as the 10:30 a.m. Mass came to an end, Veronica felt a sense of peace settle over her. She sat quietly for a moment with her son Jordan, exchanging goodbyes with other parishioners and waiting for the pews to clear before she and her son also slipped out into the center aisle and began making their way to the big doors at the back of the church. As Veronica and Jordan passed by Father Breen on their way outside, Veronica stopped for a second to shake hands with the priest. She had been so grateful over the past year for his support and encouragement. Now, as she glanced toward the parking lot where she knew Tim would be waiting, Father Breen smiled and gave her hand an encouraging squeeze. Veronica smiled back and thanked him again for his prayers and blessings before stepping from the dim interior of the church into the sun and heat. Outside, Veronica's killer watched from a distance as Veronica and her son walked hand in hand across the church parking lot to where Veronica's estranged husband, Tim, waited for them, his arms crossed, leaning against the side of his car. The killer had already spent hours following Veronica on other occasions, still waiting for the right opportunity. But this morning's setup looked promising. The child would be out of the picture, and as Veronica turned away from Jordan and Tim to walk over to her own car, she looked relaxed and didn't even seem to notice her surroundings, or her killer. And that was unusual because Veronica's killer was such a big guy, he was 6'5" tall and nearly 300 pounds, that people did tend to notice him wherever he went. And usually he welcomed the attention. Just not now. The killer smiled, satisfied with how things were going so far, and watched as Veronica pulled her phone out of her purse and started tapping her screen as she walked the final distance across the lot to her car. A few moments later, Veronica disappeared into her SUV and started up the engine. As she maneuvered her car out of the parking lot and out onto the expressway that was the fastest route from the church to her home, where she and her boyfriend Brian would soon meet, Veronica did not notice the light-colored large SUV that had slid into the lane several cars behind her. The killer knew where Veronica was headed next, and so he quickly passed her vehicle and rushed all the way to the turnoff into her neighborhood, the Bridgewater development, before Veronica got there. By now, the killer had spent enough time spying on Veronica that he knew she liked to park inside of her garage, and then she would enter her house through the door in the garage that connected to the kitchen of the house. The killer also knew that Veronica always immediately closed the garage door behind her after she pulled her car inside. So he pulled into a nearby alley and waited, knowing that he would have to move very quickly once she arrived and pulled her car down the driveway into the garage so that he did not get blocked out by the closing garage door. And sure enough, as soon as Veronica arrived at the development and pulled into her driveway, her killer was on the move. As the garage door slowly opened, he pulled his van right into the driveway behind her. He caught a quick glimpse of Veronica's face in her rearview mirror, and he saw her eyes widen in sudden alarm. Then he was out of his car, gloves on, hat pulled down low, and a tactical sleeve covering most of his face. As the man calmly walked with great long strides into her garage, Veronica scrambled out of her car, dropping her purse and all of its contents onto the floor. Then she stood up and ran to the door that connected the garage to her house, and she opened it up. But before she could get through that door and lock it behind her, her attacker had lunged and caught her by the wrist. Adrenaline now flooding through Veronica's body, she twisted violently out of his grasp and then flung herself forward, falling first into the kitchen, and then after getting back onto her feet, she lunged even farther into the house, into the living room. As she did this, she and her attacker, who was still right behind her, smashed into tables and chairs and paintings and knocked things off counters and tabletops in the wall, until finally, in the living room, Veronica's killer grabbed hold of her arm again, and he spun Veronica around to face him while he simultaneously raised his pistol and began firing. At least 4 shots were fired from the killer's high-point semi-automatic weapon. One of the bullets hit Veronica's right shoulder and arm, breaking bones before exiting her body. A second bullet entered above and behind her left ear and then exited on the other side of her head between her right ear and forehead. Another bullet that had entered her left ear ricocheted inside of her skull and then exited just above her right eye. The killer, seeing Veronica now bleeding out on the polished wood floor of her living room, knew without a doubt that the 2 shots he had fired into her head were lethal. Pausing only to catch his breath, Veronica's killer quickly scooped up the spent shell casings from the floor before taking off back to the garage and grabbing Veronica's white iPhone off the garage floor before jumping into his large SUV. Later that day, the killer would call a friend and ask for instructions on how to unlock an iPhone and also how to remove the battery from an iPhone. But for now, as he was making his escape, the killer simply powered off Veronica's iPhone, put it in his pocket, and then drove as casually as he could out of the Bridgewater development and headed back to the expressway and began driving towards Nashville. Earlier that same morning, Jenny arrived home from her overnight shift, not at 7 a.m. as she had first told detectives, but at about 9:30 a.m. Her boyfriend, Corey, was not there at the time. Tired, Jenny immediately showered and then went right to bed. Because she lived with roommates that she did not entirely trust, Jenny actually kept her handbag with her in the bed as she slept. It contained her wallet and her car keys. At some point that morning, shortly after Jenny had climbed into bed, Jenny woke up to find Corey bending over her. When he kissed her and told her he was going out for a little while, she wondered sleepily if he was also slipping his hand under her covers to grab the keys to her minivan. But since her only concern at the moment was just to go back to sleep, Jenny turned over again and closed her eyes. She didn't wake up again until mid-afternoon. That was when Corey woke her and told her he wanted to take her out to an early dinner at a restaurant near Nashville called TGI Fridays. They got into Corey's car, a champagne-colored Cadillac Escalade with a vanity license plate that read Big Man, and headed off for their evening out. At some point along the way, a thin white phone slipped off the console of Corey's Escalade and landed on the floor. Jenny leaned down, picked up the iPhone, and put it back on the console next to the black Android phone that she recognized as Corey's. She didn't ask him where the white phone had come from. Jenny knew that Corey had all kinds of business dealings with all kinds of people, and she suspected that some of that business and some of those people were pretty shady. It had been Corey, after all, who had convinced Jenny to steal her soon-to-be ex-husband's high-point 9mm handgun, along with plenty of ammunition, back in July. At the time, Corey said that Jenny might need it for protection, and she had been carrying it around ever since in the back of her minivan in a red-maroon lunch bag. Except that Jenny's ex had filed a stolen weapon report with police, and when Jenny had gone to look for the gun a few weeks ago, thinking she should just return it in case police decided to come question her about the missing weapon, the gun and the maroon bag had disappeared from her car. She'd asked Corey at the time if he'd taken it, since he sometimes borrowed her van and also helped her now and then take groceries out of the rear compartment, but he denied ever touching it. By the afternoon of the following day, Monday, August 30th, Corey was in a terrible mood. He told Jenny that police were after him for information about the recent murder of his business partner's wife and that they had impounded both his Cadillac Escalade and his cell phone. Corey told her that she really needed to help him out. Just to get the cops off of his back, he told them that he had been with her all day yesterday, and if police got in touch with her, that's what she should tell them. That he'd been at the apartment with her from 7 a.m. till they left the apartment together to go eat dinner at TGI Fridays. Jenny agreed because she knew this wasn't really a request, it was an order, and she knew better than to cross Corey when he was in one of his moods. But it wasn't until after police did talk to Jenny that evening outside of the strip mall, and she confirmed Corey's alibi, that Jenny started to feel uneasy and a little afraid about having done what Corey had told her to do. As details of Veronica's murder started being reported all over the news, Jenny thought again about that missing gun that she had taken from her ex and about that white iPhone she had seen in Corey's Escalade. And then things got even worse. It turned out that one of Corey's acquaintances had told police that Corey had asked him to clean a high-point pistol for Corey and that Corey had brought the weapon to him inside of a maroon lunch bag. And shortly after that development, Jenny had overheard Corey making plans to leave the United States for Barbados, an island country in the West Indies. Worried that she was about to get caught in the middle of a legal mess, and increasingly afraid that Corey was the person who had taken that gun out of her minivan, Jenny decided she had to come clean to police about Corey's alibi. So on September 11th, Jenny called the Metropolitan Nashville Police and told Detectives Injichok and Crumby the truth about Corey's alibi. That on the morning of Sunday, August 29th, Jenny had no idea where Corey was between 7 a.m. and mid-afternoon when he woke her up to bring her to TGI Fridays. After this admission, Jenny agreed to fully cooperate with police. She also agreed to a DNA swab and allowed police to examine her phone. And police quickly ruled Jenny herself out as a suspect since her phone was nowhere near the crime scene when Veronica was murdered. But what Jenny didn't know when she called the detectives to tell the truth was that the police had actually already come to the conclusion that Corey had to be the killer. According to the phone forensics expert from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, on the day of Veronica's murder, even though her phone had been powered off, they were able to track its position. And on that day, after her death, Veronica's white iPhone followed the exact same track as another phone. And that phone was Corey's black Android. It would turn out Jenny's suspicions were correct. Corey had indeed taken the gun from the back of her minivan, and he had used that gun to kill Veronica Boza. He would be arrested on September 21st, 23 days after the murder. But that was not the end of this murder investigation, because police were about to uncover one final unbelievable twist to the Veronica Boza homicide, which was literally the kind of thing you would expect to see in a movie. It would turn out Corey was not Veronica's only killer. Although this other killer was far away from the Bridgewater development at the time of the crime, and he never so much as touched the weapon that was used to kill his wife, it was Tim Bouza, Veronica's estranged husband, who had first planted the idea that led to Veronica's death. Back in late June, early July, bitter and broke over a divorce that looked like it would end with him getting less time than he wanted with his son and less money than he wanted from Victoria, Tim and his business partner and best friend, Corey Cotham, who was also broke and also facing relationship issues, started talking about a crisscross murder scheme, just like the one that Hollywood actors Danny DeVito and Billy Crystal played out in the 1987 comedy thriller Throw Mama from the Train, where Billy Crystal's character agrees to murder the mother of Danny DeVito's character, and Danny DeVito's character agrees to murder the wife of Billy Crystal's character. But unlike in the movie, where neither the overbearing mother or the deceitful wife is actually killed, Corey and Tim decided they should do this and actually follow through. The plan was that Corey would kill Veronica for Tim, which he did, and in exchange, Tim would kill the ex-husband of one of Corey's girlfriends for Corey. However, Tim did not get a chance to commit that murder before they were caught. And although Tim later denied that the two men had any kind of formal agreement to carry out either murder, investigators would go on to find plenty of evidence to the contrary, at least when it came to the murder of Tim's wife, Veronica. That evidence included the 13 phone calls that Tim and Corey exchanged on the day Veronica was killed, along with several text messages in which the men planned the murder. And just after the murder, Tim got an update from Corey saying, quote, "It's done." It would turn out that in addition to just wanting their respective kill targets erased because of the trouble they were apparently causing them, both men, Corey and Tim, had a big financial motive to carry out the murders. Specifically, the murder of Veronica. Corey expected to be paid $35,000 for killing Veronica, and Tim, who knew if Veronica was killed before their divorce finalized, would be the beneficiary of his wife's $550,000 life insurance policy. The Boza's financial planner later testified that on the day of Veronica's funeral, Tim had approached him immediately after, asking when Tim could expect that life insurance payout. In February of 2012, Corey Cotham was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and, quote, especially aggravated robbery, and was sentenced to life without parole plus 25 years. 6 months later, in October, Tim, who had testified against Corey at Corey's earlier trial, was sentenced to life in prison as well, but with the possibility of parole after 51 years. As of 2021, Veronica and Tim's son, Jordan, was living with an aunt in Tennessee and was going to college. IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient, is a measure of someone's intelligence. To find your IQ, you need to take an official IQ test, which gives you an IQ score. The vast majority of people will score about 100 as their IQ, and so that's considered to be the average intelligence for any given person. But a very small number of people will score somewhere between 130 and 160. And so that's considered to be a very high IQ. Those are very, very gifted people. And then there is an even smaller group of people that score above 160. And so that is the genius class. Anybody who scores above 160 is literally a genius. To give you a sense of just how rare that is, Albert Einstein, who is largely considered to be one of the smartest people to have ever lived, he was not even considered a genius, at least not by his IQ. He was about 160, so right on the cusp of geniusness. But as we will learn from this story, having an exceptionally high IQ does not make you immune to making unfathomably bad choices. In 1991, 31-year-old Jackie Katarik, who had a genius IQ of 170, so she was smarter than Albert Einstein, she graduated from UCLA Medical School with honors. She completed her medical residency, which is like a multi-year apprenticeship for new doctors, at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, which is one of the very best hospitals in America. After that, she opened her very own practice just north of LA in a town called Bakersfield, California, and she also became a part-time professor at her alma mater, UCLA. By all accounts, Jackie was brilliant, she was successful, and she loved what she did, and her patients and her students loved her right back. Fast forward to 2010, Jackie was 49 years old, and she was still running her very successful practice, and she was still teaching at UCLA, and she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with a 58-year-old man named William Moody. While the details of their relationship are not really publicly known, it's fairly easy to deduce from the reporting that came from this case that Jackie and William fought a lot. On Wednesday, August 25th of that year, Jackie was spotted by herself at a Mediterranean restaurant in Bakersfield, California, having some drinks. And then at some point during the night, she called a ride service to pick her up and take her home again. Even though we don't know this for sure, it's assumed she was too intoxicated to drive, and that's why she called the ride service. The following morning, Jackie did not show up for work. Her assistant at her medical practice is the one who noticed Jackie had not shown up. And so when she didn't, she called her boss, but her boss didn't pick up. And so after a couple of failed attempts at getting in touch with Jackie, this assistant called Jackie's boyfriend, William. And so William, he picks up the phone, and when the assistant asks him, hey, have you seen Jackie? She has not come into work today. William actually says, yes, I saw her last night. William would explain to the assistant that the night before he was in his house by himself in Bakersfield, California, not far from this restaurant where Jackie was last seen. And he said that at some point, unannounced, he saw Jackie pull up in front of his house. And so he could tell from her general demeanor and her look and her pace that she was upset about something, or he just sensed there was going to be some conflict if he went to the door. And so he decided to actually slip out the back door and kind of run away from his property before Jackie could see him. And so he actually left the property and went to a friend's house who was nearby and spent the night with this friend. And so when the assistant called William, William was actually still at this friend's house. He had not been back to his actual property. And so he would tell the assistant that, the last I saw of Jackie, it was late at night. She had pulled up in front of my house, but then I split. So I don't know what she did. I assume she left. But William would tell the assistant that, I'll go back over to my house and I'll see if she's still there or if there's some indication of where she might have gone. And so William hangs up the phone, he leaves his friend's house and walks the couple of blocks back to his own property. And when he gets there, sure enough, right out front of his house is Jackie's car. Now, William knew his house was locked and Jackie didn't have a key. And so Jackie must just be sitting in her car waiting for him to return. And so William walks up to the car expecting to see Jackie and expecting probably to fight about something. But when he gets up to the car, Jackie's not in there. But her purse, her cell phone, her wallet, that's all over the inside of the car. And so William turns and looks at his house thinking, is she in the house? Did she somehow get in? Is she on the back of the house? And so William just starts yelling out for Jackie as he begins to walk around his house. And so as he goes around towards the back of the house, he's yelling out for Jackie. No one's calling back. And then he reaches the back of the house and there's no sign of Jackie, but he sees there's a shovel on the ground near his back door. And then he looks at his back door and it looks very obviously like someone, probably Jackie, had been using the shovel to try to pry open the back door. Like they were trying to break in, but it hadn't worked. And so William just kind of sees that and then continues walking around the other side of the house. So he's completely walked around the entire property. There's no sign of Jackie. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must have gotten in somehow. She's in the house somewhere. And so William goes to the front door. He unlocks his front door. He goes inside. And even though he knows all of his doors have been locked, all the windows are locked, he's kind of on edge because he's thinking she's got to be in here. But he walks through his house and there's no sign of Jackie. And there's no sign that anybody else had been in there since he was last in there. And so he's totally puzzled because it doesn't really make any sense that Jackie's car is out front. But he's thinking, okay, maybe she got here and then she called a ride service and went somewhere else. I'm sure she's fine. So William calls the medical assistant and says, look, her car's here, her stuff's here, but she's not here. I don't know what she's doing. I'll let you know if anything comes of it. The assistant said, I really feel like something's off here and we really do need to call the police. And so William would say, you know what? I think that's a good idea too. Let's just get them involved and make sure she's okay. And so they call the police and the police start by going to Jackie's residence. But Jackie's not there, and there's no sign of her. The neighbors haven't seen her. And so the police go to William's household, and they search Jackie's car, and they search William's house and the surrounding area right outside. But there's really no clues as to what actually happened to Jackie. And so after the police talked to a bunch of neighbors and friends and family, they just told William and this medical assistant that at this point, they just need to wait, and that hopefully Jackie will just come out of wherever it is she's hiding or wherever she's gone. Maybe she's upset. Maybe she was fighting with William and she's run off somewhere, but we just gotta wait and see what happens. 2 days later, Jackie was still unaccounted for. No one knew where she was. No one had heard from her. No one had seen her when William's friend went over to his house. William, the day before, so 24 hours after Jackie had been reported missing, he had left the country on a prearranged trip. But he was not being looked at as a potential suspect or having anything to do with Jackie's disappearance, and so he was allowed to go. And so this friend had been asked to go to his property to feed his fish. And so he shows up on Saturday, that's 48 hours after Jackie has been reported missing. He goes inside the house, and immediately he is hit with this terrible smell inside of William's house. And so he's covering his face, and he's walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell is coming from. He thinks it could be the fridge, maybe something's rotting that's fallen out or the door's open or something, but it's not the fridge. He goes to the trash, it's not the trash. He goes to the fish, it's not the fish. He makes his way over to the fireplace, and he realizes that's where the smell is coming from. And so kind of reluctantly, he gets down and he kind of smells inside the fireplace, but it's not really coming from the area where the logs would be. It's coming from up in the chimney flue. And so he puts his head down and kind of turns and looks up the chimney, and about 2 feet up the flue, dangling down, are 2 human legs, and they would be Jackie's legs. It would turn out a few days earlier, when Jackie was at that restaurant drinking by herself, she did call that ride service to come give her a ride home, presumably because she was too intoxicated to drive. But before they showed up, Jackie just got into her car anyways and drove to her estranged boyfriend's house. And so she gets there. William, meanwhile, is sneaking out the back and running off to his friend's house. Jackie does not see him. She makes her way up to the front door and presumably tries to knock and get William's attention, but when no attention is given to her and it seems like no one's inside, she decides she's going to try to get into the house. And so the front door was locked, the windows were all locked, she got to the back door, and that was locked, so she tried the shovel and tried to pry it open, but it didn't work. And so eventually, Jackie climbed up the permanent ladder that's on the back of the house. There isn't much online describing this permanent ladder. It could be a fire escape, or it could be some sort of lawn decoration, but there was something on the back of the house that you could climb up if you wanted to. And so Jackie climbed up this permanent ladder and actually got onto the roof. And then when she was on the roof, she walked to the center where the chimney was, and there was this cap over the top of the chimney to prevent things from going into the chimney. She removed the cap and then lowered herself feet first into this chimney. Now, it's unclear how quickly she descended this chimney, but eventually she got stuck because the width of this chimney was not uniform. It started fairly wide at the top and then narrowed as it went down. And so at some point, as she went down feet first, she would have gotten completely wedged. It wouldn't have mattered if her hands were above her head or by her side, because either way, they were useless. She couldn't bend her arms, and there was nothing to grab onto, so her arms couldn't do anything. And then below her, there was nothing for her feet to push onto. And so she was totally stuck. And since William was not in his house, he had left, there was no one there to help her. And so Jackie probably started screaming for help, but as soon as she did that, and she exhaled that huge scream, her chest would have constricted from exhaling, and that would have shrunk her chest, making her thinner, and she would have dropped a little bit farther into the chimney. And then when she breathed back in again, her chest would not be able to expand back to its original position because the chimney would be restricting her. It's like this brace that's around her chest that as she gets lower and lower and lower, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And so her lung capacity is shrinking second by second. And as her lung capacity shrinks, she would not have had the lung strength to emit a loud enough sound to get anybody's attention. Basically, she couldn't scream. She couldn't take in a big enough breath to scream out. And so she was just stuck in this totally compromised position in this claustrophobic little chimney where she could do nothing but wait and hope maybe William or someone took notice of the fact that she was in here, even though, again, she couldn't get anyone's attention. And so most likely she would have begun rationing her breaths because, again, every time she breathes out too much, she goes farther and farther, making it harder and harder to breathe. And at some point, starting on Thursday night, she would have heard William in the house. He would have been only a few feet away from her, but she can't make a sound loud enough to get his attention. And we know she was alive by Thursday night because neighbors heard someone faintly yelling help on Friday night. So nearly 48 hours after she got stuck in the chimney, it's believed she was still alive. And those neighbors, when they heard that faint call for help, they assumed it was kids in a nearby pool, and so they didn't do anything about it. When they found out what had happened, they thought, you know what? It was coming from that chimney. That's where we heard it coming from. Jackie would die shortly after the neighbors heard her calling for help because she was dead by the time the friend found her in the chimney the following day on Saturday. Jackie would die from mechanical asphyxia, which is basically suffocation, but it's caused by some physical obstruction. And in this case, it was the chimney. The chimney literally crushed her chest to the point where she could no longer inflate her lungs. It would take firefighters approximately 5 hours to break this chimney down to finally retrieve Jackie's body. No charges were filed against anyone for Jackie's death. It was ruled to be an accident caused by an unbelievable error in judgment by an unbelievably brilliant woman. Our next story is called Gold Digger. In July of 1988, 18-year-old Adiana and her husband, Jay Dickinson, were living in Anchorage, Alaska, just 1 month after getting married in Nevada. Jay, who had lived in Alaska for several years before Adiana joined him, had taken up an interest in something called placer mining, which is basically mining riverbeds for minerals like gold. And as soon as Adiana moved in, she picked up the hobby as well. The area they mined for gold was south of Anchorage in Cook Inlet. Jay owned a gold claim there. Over the years, Jay had found it to be very cumbersome just getting to Cook Inlet. Even though it was just south of Anchorage, the roads forced him to drive all the way around the inlet before being allowed in. However, he had discovered a shortcut. During low tide in the inlet, one of the two northern waterways that fed into the inlet, called the Turnagain Arm, would be completely dried up and it would turn into this huge open mudflat. And so Jay could leave Anchorage, go south, leave the highway at the Turnagain Arm, and drive directly over and across the mudflats and reach his gold claim in half the time. On the evening of July 14th, the young couple decided that the next day they wanted to go gold mining. And so Jay checked the tides of the inlet to see what the status would be for the next day, and he was pleasantly surprised to see that very early the next morning there would be a low tide, perfect for them. And so the next day, the couple got up at sunrise, they hopped in their Jeep, and they started heading south. They left Anchorage, they hopped on the highway, and they went south all the way to the access point to Turnagain Arm, and they looked out in front of them, and sure enough, it's completely low tide, and it's ready for them to drive over. As they turned off the highway and drove down the small access road that brought them to the actual mudflats, they passed by a series of signs telling them not to go on the mudflats. But Jay had done this dozens of times without any incident, and Deanna, she'd done it only a couple of times, but both times it had been no big deal, so neither of them paid any attention to the cautionary signs. Soon they were rolling across the mudflats on their way to Jay's gold claim. But on their way, their Jeep suddenly got stuck in the mud. And Deanna, she hopped out, she went to the back of the Jeep and began pressing as Jay pushed down on the accelerator. The Jeep eventually lurched forward and was free of the mud, but Deanna was actually now stuck in the mud because as she pushed, she drove both of her legs down deep into this mud. She tried to pull herself out, she couldn't do it, and so Jay hopped out of the Jeep, walked around the mud, and got to his wife and began pulling on her. He couldn't get her out, but he told her he had a good idea. He went back to his Jeep and he got his dredge that he was going to use to try to look for gold, and he pushed it down into the mud and began sucking up the mud around one of her legs. And he figured if he just created enough of an air pocket by sucking out enough mud, she could pull that leg out, and then he could do the same thing with the other leg. And although it was a slow process, it was working, and slowly but surely they managed to get one of her legs out of the mud right as the 38-degree water began coming in, because tide was starting to come in. Neither of them were panicking because the dredge was clearly working, and if they could just get her other foot out, it wouldn't matter that the water was starting to come in. They would be able to get back to land, back to the highway, before they got caught in the high tide. And so he put the dredge down next to her other leg, and he began pulling the mud out, and it was working, but then the dredge broke, and he couldn't fix it. And Deanna's starting to panic, Jay's starting to panic. He puts the dredge back in the Jeep, he gets a shovel, and he runs back to his wife and begins frantically trying to dig her out, but he can barely move the mud. It's like it's cement. And that's actually the reason why there's so many signs around these mudflats telling people to not go on them. Because there's a very small window of time between low tide and high tide where the ground goes from being solid and you can drive a car on it to being very soupy, and it's very easy to get stuck in it. But before the tide completely comes back in again, it re-hardens. And so if you're stuck in the mud and you don't get out again before it hardens again, you will remain stuck in the mud and 30 feet of water will come in on top of you. And so Deanna's trying to pull her leg out and she's panicking, and Jay is doing everything he can to try to get down there and get her foot out, but the ground's hardened at this point. Her leg is completely trapped inside of the mud, and the water is starting to come in faster and faster and faster. Jay told her he had to run back to the highway to try to get some help. He couldn't take his Jeep. There was too much water that had come in. It's now up to their knees, and so their Jeep's worthless. And so Jay is running away from Adriana, who's screaming for help. She's trying to get her leg out. There's nothing he can do. And so he's running through the water. He gets up to the highway, and he manages to flag down some motorists, and he pleads with them to please come out into the water and help me get my wife out. She's stuck in the mud. And they look out and she's flailing around and screaming, and the water is now up to her waist. And so two of these motorists actually run down into the water with Jay and risk their own lives to try to get Adriana out. Meanwhile, another motorist took off for a nearby cafe where he could alert authorities that someone is trapped and they need someone out there right now. Very quickly, the fire department and the state troopers arrived on scene, and they look out and they see the motorists and Jay trying to pull Adriana out, and the water has crept even higher up on her body. She's screaming, she's panicked, and Mike Opolka, who's one of these state troopers, he immediately ran over to the fire department and he got this big rubber tube, and he charged into the water and ran out to Adriana and grabbed her and said, everything's going to be okay, we're going to get you out of here. And he gave her the tube and he says, you need to start breathing through this, the water's going to be over your head soon. And so Adriana, who's shaking because she's hypothermic and because she's terrified, she takes this tube and she's clutching it as the other rescue workers are running down with all their equipment to try to get her out. And then not that long after that, the tide had come in to the point where it was over her head, and all they could see of Adriana was this rubber tube she was keeping out of the water. But unfortunately, every attempt the rescue workers made failed, including getting a helicopter in and attaching a harness to Adriana and trying to pull her out that way. Nothing worked. The first responders and the motorists and everyone stayed with Deanna, holding on to her and trying to pull her out, but at some point the water was too cold and it was getting too deep, and they could not stay out there with her long enough. Michael Polka, the state trooper, was the last one out there with her, and he was struggling to keep his head over the water as he's still trying to pull her up. And at some point he noticed the tube she had been breathing in popped up on the surface with both ends exposed, so it had come out of her mouth. And so he fumbled with it, but his hand was so cold from the water he couldn't really grip it. He tried to reach down to give her the hose, but she was flailing and panicking, and she couldn't get the hose. She could not breathe through it, and at some point she went still. And Mike knew there was nothing he could do. She was gone, and so he let go of her. And being hypothermic himself, he barely was able to swim back to the shore and get out and go up onto the highway with the others. And there they sat for the next 6 hours as they waited for the tide to come all the way in and then go all the way out again and loosen up to the point where they could go out and retrieve Deanna's body. Unfortunately, had authorities been alerted to Deanna's situation a little bit earlier, they could have got a special water pump out to the mudflats, and it would have been able to get her out even if the mud was hardened. But by the time that pump arrived on scene, it was already too late. The water was well over Deanna's head, and she had already let go of the tube.
The next and final story of today's episode is called All the Way Down.
Midday on June 10th, 1981, an Italian man and his 6-year-old son walked to the edge of their property in Frascati, which is an area in Italy known as the hub of Rome's local wine industry. The father needed to repair a section of their fence, and his son, who he said had the soul of Huckleberry Finn, wanted to tag along. But as soon as the work began, Alfredo just wanted to go play in the vineyards, and so he ran off. And the father didn't think much of it because his son always played in the vineyards and just figured he would see him back at the house. When the father finished up the work around 7 p.m. and walked back into his house, he was surprised that Alfredo wasn't there. And so he asked his wife, have you seen our son? And she said, no, can you go out and find him? Because dinner's going to be on the table any minute. So the father goes back outside, expecting to see Alfredo come running out from behind some hiding place, but he doesn't. And he yells out for his son and doesn't get a response. And so he begins walking his property and yelling for Alfredo, and he's not finding him. And so after 2 hours of looking, he finally just calls the police. The police arrive, and initially it's just a couple of officers with flashlights, and they spend about 2 hours looking as well. They can't find him, so they call in backup in the form of officers with sniffer dogs, and the dogs began searching the property for another 3 hours, and they still couldn't find him. A little after midnight, the fire department, known in Italy as the fire brigade, they joined in as well. Shortly thereafter, a fire brigade officer was on the edge of Alfredo's property when he discovered a small hole in the ground. It would turn out Alfredo's neighbor had dug an illegal well, which was a common practice at the time, and generally, if you dug one of these wells and you struck water, you would report the well. But if you dug down and you didn't find water, you would just cover it up with a girder and you wouldn't tell anyone. In this case, however, the hole the officer was looking at did not have anything covering it, and so he knelt down and he yelled Alfredo's name into this hole, and at first he didn't hear anything. Then he yelled again, and he heard Alfredo yell back for his mother. Alfredo must not have seen the opening as he was running around playing, and he fell feet first into an 80-meter deep shaft. After Alfredo was found, the fire brigade took over rescue efforts, and so additional fire brigade units were called to help. But as soon as those additional units showed up, the captains of the different units began arguing with each other because it wasn't really clear how they were going to get him out. And unfortunately, the fire brigade immediately made a very bad decision. They decided to lower a plank into the shaft attached by a rope that he could grab onto, and they could pull him out that way. But when they lowered it at about 24 meters, the plank got stuck inside of the tunnel. And when they yanked on the rope to try to free it, the rope came off of the plank, but the plank remained wedged in the tunnel, blocking the tunnel. By the following morning, TV crews had swarmed the area, and one of them offered up a two-way microphone that could be lowered down into the hole so they could talk directly to Alfredo. When the microphone was finally lowered down next to his face, he was crying and pleading for them to get him out and that he missed his mother. Amateur spelunker Tullio Barnaby, a 23-year-old, had come over and joined the vigil that night. The plank plan shocked him for its foolishness, and so too did the scene. It was like everyone and no one was in charge. The well opening had been widened in hopes that a very skinny person would be willing to be lowered down to remove the piece of wood that was obstructing the tunnel. And since Tullio was a spelunker and was comfortable in confined spaces and was pretty skinny, he volunteered himself to do it. As he was lowered down, he quickly realized the inside of this tunnel was not a straight shot. It was more like a corkscrew. And so because of its windy nature, he was not able to get down to the wood. And so he signaled to go back up again. And when he reached the surface, he didn't have the wood in hand, but he told the fire brigade that because of the windy nature, it's unlikely Alfredo fell all the way to the bottom. He's probably stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a good thing. But we have to be really careful as we pull him out that we don't do anything that unintentionally causes him to slip farther into the hole. Tullio's suggestion was they go out and recruit professional spelunkers to be involved in the rescue because they would understand how to get someone out of such a tight space so far down in the ground. But the fire brigade disregarded his advice and said we don't have enough time for that. At 6 a.m. the next day, about 12 hours after Alfredo's fallen into the swell, the fire brigade would make another very poor decision. They decided they would drill down another hole parallel to the one Alfredo was in, and they would drill down past the point they believed Alfredo was, at which point they would turn and drill laterally and connect to the tunnel Alfredo's in, grabbing Alfredo, pulling him across, and back up the new tunnel. Tullio objected, and he said the vibrations from this drill are almost certainly going to dislodge the boy and cause him to slip farther into the tunnel. But once again, the fire brigade did not listen to him. The drilling began about 2 hours later, and by that afternoon, Alfredo's plight had become major national news, with every single TV station playing a 24/7 live broadcast of the well, watching the drilling take place. Even the Italian president made a special trip to the well to see how it was going. But the drilling was very slow, and Alfredo, he had that microphone next to his head, and he was crying half the time, and the other times he was just pleading with them to get him out and saying he was cold, or that he was tired, and the rescuers would say, we're gonna be down there to get you, don't fall asleep, we're gonna get you out of there. Finally, after 36 hours, they had drilled all the way down to their intended stopping point, and they began drilling across into Alfredo's well. When they finally broke into Alfredo's well, rescuers rushed in with flashlights and looked up and looked down, and there was no sign of Alfredo. And they called it up to the top and they said he's not here. And then all of a sudden they heard a faint voice coming from all the way down at the bottom of the well. The vibrations from all of the drilling had indeed caused Alfredo to slip all the way to the very bottom. They estimated he was approximately 30 meters below this new parallel tunnel, and at that depth, the temperatures would be freezing, and so now Alfredo, on top of everything else, was facing hypothermia. They quickly lowered the microphone again down to Alfredo, and they told him, "We're gonna get you out of there. We're sorry we dropped you, but we're gonna get you." And Alfredo's voice came back weak. He was tired. He was sore. He was freezing. He was crying. It was like the situation was just getting so much worse by the second, and rescuers knew they had to get to him probably in the next couple of hours, or that was it. And so another skinny man volunteered to go down into the hole, and they lowered him, and he would go all the way down to the bottom where Alfredo was. And he would call up that he found him and that Alfredo was alive. But Alfredo was stuck waist deep in this mud that the guy could not pull him out of. And so every time he'd begin to raise him slightly out of the mud, he'd lose his grip and he would fall back into the mud, going deeper into the mud each time. And after the seventh time of not being able to do it, Alfredo was getting dangerously close to being neck deep in the mud. And so the guy had to be pulled back out again. As soon as he was pulled back out again, more men volunteered themselves to go in there and try to yank him out, but many of them were not able to even get down to Alfredo. They would get stuck along the way. A couple did get to Alfredo, but they said his condition was worsening, he was weak, he wasn't even assisting trying to get pulled out. It was clear they were reaching the end. Finally, at 6:36 a.m. on Saturday, so 2.5 days after Alfredo fell in, they could not get him to respond on that two-way microphone. And so they sent down a sonar probe and they could not detect a heartbeat, and doctors declared him dead. The next day, liquid nitrogen was poured into the hole to preserve the body, and then 31 days later, they were finally able to extract it. After it was all over, the 25 million plus people that watched this take place live on television were crushed with what happened to Alfredo. There was a general sense that lots of people let this poor child down, which led to his death. But the person who was ultimately held accountable for it was the neighbor, who had illegally dug the well. And so the neighbor was charged with manslaughter and was sent to jail, but their sentence is not publicly available online.
Was closing in on a hot 90 degrees Fahrenheit in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as Ray Brennan pulled open the heavy glass door of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel on July 21st, 1976. But the heat outside was the last thing on Ray's mind. He was just excited to be here at the Pennsylvania Convention of the American Legion, the nation's biggest veterans group. Ray, a retired Air Force captain, was now back among his people. Ray was 61 years old, and he had never married, but in some ways, he was married to the Air Force. His career spanned more than 2 decades, from the eve of World War II until 1960, when heart troubles forced him to retire. He never saw combat, but he helped save lives by running hospitals for wounded airmen in the Korean War. Ray walked a little taller when he was at these conventions. He knew that to an outsider, this gathering of more than 4,000 Legionnaires might look like a bunch of older men and women with graying hair, a lot of them wearing uniforms that didn't fit quite as well as they used to. But Ray knew that the people in the huge marble lobby in front of him were the everyday heroes who had risked their lives serving their country from World War II to the Vietnam War. And Ray was one of them. To all these veterans, he was Captain Ray Brennan, bookkeeper for American Legion Post Number 42 in Towanda, Pennsylvania. As Ray straightened his shoulders and began his first round of handshakes with old friends, he felt a twinge of regret. Ray knew that if he had not had that second heart attack in 1960, he'd still be on active military duty until mandatory retirement at 64 years old. Still trim and fit, Ray was sure he still had what it took to wear the uniform. But Ray gave himself a shake to snap out of it. He knew he had a good life. Even his years out of the military were not so bad. A passionate seashell collector, Ray had been asked by the Smithsonian Institution to help organize the National Shell Collection. He even got a seashell named after him. And anyway, Ray had been looking forward to this convention for months, and now that he was actually here, he didn't want to waste time regretting the past. For the next 3 days, Ray had a great time, telling stories, listening to speeches, and catching up with people he loved over dinner and drinks. Then, on July 24th, he made the 180-mile drive back home to Towanda, a town of 3,000 people near the New York border. 2 days after he had returned from the convention, Ray was sitting in his kitchen, still talking about the convention to his sister, Maisie Travis, when suddenly, Ray stopped talking mid-sentence and clutched his chest. He had the shooting pain that felt almost like it was burning, and it left Ray breathless and struggling to keep from falling out of his chair. His sister, Maisie, dropped her newspaper and grabbed her brother by the arm to steady him, and she said she would call Ray's doctor right away. But Ray really didn't want the help. He was terrified of having another heart attack, but this pain, it just felt different. It felt like his heart was just racing. He was sure it would just pass. Shuffling slowly into the living room, Ray collapsed into his favorite armchair, and he told his sister that he was just worn out from all the socializing and eating too much rich food and staying up too late swapping war stories, and that he really just needed to close his eyes and let this thing pass. And before long, Ray fell asleep. But when he woke up from his nap, Maisie could tell that Ray was worse, not better. His face was pale, and it was getting harder for him to breathe. By the afternoon, he was literally gasping for breath, which really frightened Maisie. So Maisie sat down next to him in his armchair and insisted that he go to a hospital. Ray still hated the idea, but his breathing was getting so labored that he was getting scared too, and so he reluctantly agreed. They slowly walked out to her car, and then after getting inside, Maisie drove him to a hospital in the next town over. When they arrived, a nurse immediately placed an oxygen mask over Ray's nose and mouth. Then she took his temperature and saw that he was running a fever of 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The nurse helped Ray onto a gurney and wheeled him into the emergency room for more tests, which would include chest x-rays. Ray felt grateful that he could just lie down. A little while later, Maisie stood at Ray's bedside and held his hand as an emergency room doctor walked in with a very concerned look on his face. The x-ray they had taken showed that Ray had a dangerous buildup of fluid in his lungs. That's why Ray was gasping for breath. The doctor asked Maisie to please step out for a moment, and then once she had, the doctor told Ray that he was going to drain the fluid in his lungs himself. The doctor helped Ray sit up and lowered his gown to expose his ribcage, and then the doctor grabbed a long hollow needle from a nearby instrument tray. Ray winced in pain as the doctor inserted that long needle between Ray's ribs and into the space around his lungs. And then soon, the doctor was using that needle to suction out some of the fluid, relieving the pressure Ray was feeling. And for a few minutes after this procedure, Ray breathed a lot easier. But it didn't last. Within a half hour, Ray was gasping again and spitting up pinkish foam from deep inside of his lungs. The doctor drained the fluid again and again, but each time the liquid came right back. The doctor had never seen anything like it. It was almost like Ray was drowning in his own fluids. The doctor explained to Maisie that her brother's heart condition had already weakened him, and now his respiratory system was crashing, and there was little doctors could do if they couldn't remove the fluid. His condition would only get worse. And so the doctor told Maisie that he did not think Ray would live much longer. Maisie choked back tears as the thought of losing her sweet-natured brother sunk in. Ray had always been so careful of his health ever since his heart problems forced him to retire young. How could he now be at death's door? Less than a week later, and 80 miles away, Dr. Ernest Campbell stood in an examination room in Bloomsburg Hospital. His patient, a 48-year-old World War II veteran named Sam Morris, was running a high fever and having difficulty swallowing. Dr. Campbell feared that Sam might have typhoid fever, a brutal and extremely rare disease that often comes from swallowing sewage-contaminated water. Campbell had seen a lot of this disease when he was working for the Peace Corps in Kenya, but it was almost unheard of in the United States. The doctor asked Sam what he'd been doing prior to getting sick, and Sam would say that he had attended a convention in Philadelphia, and while he was there, he suffered a terrible headache and decided to come home early. As he spoke, Sam mentioned that 2 other veterans who'd attended the same convention had also been admitted to Bloomsburg Hospital. In fact, he'd seen one of them being wheeled past his room. Maybe they should be checked out too, Sam suggested. Dr. Campbell paused for a moment, wondering if there might be a link between the 3 men's illnesses. After he finished examining Sam, the doctor looked up the other two veterans. He found that they all had very similar symptoms, and one of the men, an 82-year-old widower named Bill Baird, was even sicker than Sam. It was all but impossible for all three men to have typhoid fever. Campbell knew something else, maybe something doctors had never even seen before, was preying on these men. Dr. Campbell consulted with the other men's doctors and ordered the same tests for all three veterans. The lab promised they would get the results back as soon as possible. But before the results came back, the elderly veteran, Bill, got worse. No matter what Dr. Campbell tried, Bill's lungs kept filling up with bloody foam. Dr. Campbell felt powerless as he watched his patient's life drain away. And then early on the morning of Friday, July 30th, Bill died. He'd only been in the hospital for a couple of days. Later that day, Dr. Campbell was back in his office, trying to figure out how to treat the two remaining veterans in his care. He was just thankful that the two patients were younger and stronger than Bill had been. He hoped their bodies would be able to fight off the disease on their own. While Dr. Campbell looked over their charts, a nurse knocked on his door. She had the veterans' test results. Dr. Campbell eagerly grabbed them from her, desperate for any indication of what he was fighting. But as he looked the results over, Dr. Campbell's hope drained away. The results were inconclusive. There was nothing telling him how he could treat this mystery disease. Dr. Campbell realized he was not capable of tackling this disease on his own. Whatever had infected the veterans was extremely deadly. If it was contagious, it could be the start of a massive epidemic. He put down the test results, then picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number for the federal health authorities. He knew he had to get through and tell someone before this situation got even worse. Dr. Campbell had barely put the phone down before the news media began to hear rumors about a mysterious disease that seemed to be striking veterans who attended this American Legion conference in Philadelphia. The COVID pandemic was decades in the future, but even then the public was anxious about the possibility of a disease that could spread wildly, potentially killing millions of people. The Chicago Tribune newspaper compared this Philadelphia outbreak to a popular movie at the time, The Andromeda Strain, that imagines a disease from outer space that comes to a small town on Earth and sets off a tidal wave of sickness and death. And so after that news story broke, doctors all across the country started getting all these calls from patients reporting respiratory symptoms and wondering if they too had the mystery disease. Many did not. They just had chest colds. But their panicky calls jammed up the emergency lines from coast to coast. 3 days after Dr. Campbell called for help, Dr. David Sensor rushed through the front doors of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. The CDC was home to the world's foremost disease detectives, with a mission to prevent outbreaks both in the United States and also abroad. The 51-year-old head of the agency, Dr. Sensor, had gotten word over the weekend of an emerging health crisis in Pennsylvania. Dr. Campbell at Bloomsburg Hospital was one of the first people who had called it in. The CDC took Campbell's call very seriously, especially as a flood of other calls about sick veterans around the state poured in. Despite the early hour, the building was buzzing with activity. Phones were ringing off the hook, and staff were running around passing documents to each other. Dr. Sensor reached his office, where several senior officials were waiting for him. He sat down at his desk, and they briefed him on everything they had learned. Over the weekend, a mysterious epidemic had spread like wildfire. So far, the agency knew that a total of 37 people throughout Pennsylvania had been hospitalized with headaches, chest pains, fever, and lung congestion. 13 of them had died. Dr. Sensor rubbed his forehead and let the information sink in. He asked if they'd made any progress on identifying the cause of the disease, but everyone in the room just shook their heads. They didn't even know if this disease was caused by a bacteria, a virus, or something else. The only thing they knew was that almost everyone who got sick had attended that veterans conference at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel from July 21st to the 24th. But this clue only raised more questions. Not everyone who was sick had actually been inside of that hotel. A bus driver from western Pennsylvania who had simply dropped passengers off in front of the hotel, and a female bank teller who worked across the street from the hotel had both died that morning. Neither of them had entered the hotel or participated in the conference, but they both shared the exact same symptoms as the veterans. Dr. Sensor frowned. He knew there was no way this was a coincidence. If other people had contracted the disease by just being near this hotel, it meant that whatever was infecting people was highly contagious. An outbreak like this could be catastrophic. His thoughts of a worst-case scenario were interrupted when another health officer walked into his office. This officer had just talked to a representative from the veterans group that had hosted this now infamous convention. Another man had apparently just died. Now 14 people were dead from this mystery illness. The officer handed Dr. Sensor several autopsy reports, and as he read them, Dr. Sensor's face drained of color. The reports described the victim's lungs as being covered in a thick, bacteria-filled layer that looked like Brillo pads. This layer prevented some antibiotics from penetrating the lungs, which made it very difficult to treat this infection. And so, with medicine basically unable to help fight this disease, the victim's only slim hope was for their own bodies to somehow overcome the attack on their own. Dr. Sensor looked up at all the people gathered in his office, and he wasted no time telling them what to do. They had to get a team of scientists to Philadelphia as soon as possible and find out what was killing so many people. That evening, one of the CDC's senior investigators, a 32-year-old man named Dr. Fraser, broke through a gauntlet of reporters posted in front of the CDC headquarters. They shouted questions at him, but Dr. Fraser kept his head down and walked past all of them. He didn't have any answers yet, and he didn't want to give out any wrong information, but he hoped that would change soon. Dr. Fraser was going to lead 20 members of the CDC's Epidemic Intelligence Service to investigate this outbreak. This would be one of the most intensive searches for the cause of a mass outbreak in world history. Whatever the disease was, it was moving fast. In the few hours since Dr. Sensor had ordered Dr. Fraser to assemble a team, 10 more people had died and 39 more were seriously ill. Dr. Fraser met Dr. Sensor in a quickly assembled war room filled with photos and maps of the area and victims, nearly all of them being military veterans. After Dr. Sensor gave him an update, Dr. Fraser outlined his plan for the investigation. He would lead one team in Philadelphia, collecting samples from the hotel, while another team would travel throughout Pennsylvania, interviewing patients who had been hospitalized with this disease. He was confident that they would be able to figure out any common patterns between the various patients and find whatever was causing this. Dr. Sensor agreed that this was the best approach, and so he shook Dr. Fraser's hand, wished him luck, and sent him home to pack. The next day, Dr. Fraser and his team of investigators wore gloves and protective masks as they entered the grand lobby of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. Just 2 weeks earlier, it had been packed with veterans and their families. Today, it was nearly empty, except for a few startled-looking staff members. Dr. Fraser figured that nobody wanted to stay at this hotel until the cause of the outbreak was identified. The investigators' footsteps rang out on the marble floor as they walked to the reception desk and explained their mission: to gather physical evidence inside of this hotel that could be tested for the disease. The team went to work. Dr. Fraser instructed them to gather samples from every surface and object in the hotel. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small plastic test tube. He unscrewed the top, which held a cotton swab soaked in a special solution. He carefully rubbed the swab on the reception desk and then placed it back into the test tube and labeled it. He wasn't going to overlook anything. Throughout the lobby, the EIS investigators were doing the same thing. One of them was on his hands and knees, painstakingly swabbing different sections of carpet. Another woman pulled off air conditioning grates to check the vents. Once they were done in the lobby, Dr. Fraser and his team went through every location in the hotel that had been used by the veterans during this convention. They swabbed door handles, elevator buttons, and furniture. They moved through the hotel's kitchens and bars, swiping the insides of water pitchers, coffee pots, and silverware. They collected bits of food and the ashes from the bottom of ashtrays. And then several hours later, Dr. Fraser led a team up to the roof of the hotel, 20 stories above the city. The hot August sun beat down on all of them as they scraped up bird droppings next to a large cooling tank. Dr. Fraser thought that sick pigeons might have carried the virus and maybe somehow transmitted it to the veterans, and so that's why they had to check the droppings. A little while later, the team was relieved to return to the cool lobby of the hotel. They sealed their samples in a container to be sent back to the laboratory for examination. The answer to what caused the deadly disease had to be somewhere inside one of those test tubes. Once the samples were collected, they were sent straight to the CDC's lab in Atlanta. Dr. Sensor had assembled some of the country's best scientists to test them for every disease imaginable. One of those scientists was a young microbiologist named Joseph McDade. Dr. McDade specialized in animal-borne illnesses, and it was his job to test for rare diseases such as Q fever, which could be transmitted from farm animals like goats, sheep, and cattle. So far, there wasn't any evidence that the veterans had interacted with any of those animals, but Dr. Sensor didn't want to take any chances. Unfortunately, Dr. McDade couldn't just look at the samples under a microscope and see if the bacteria that caused Q fever was present. There would be too many other microscopic organisms present. Instead, he had to isolate the bacteria and get a big enough sample to examine. It was an absurdly drawn-out process. First, Dr. McDade had to take lung tissue from someone who died from the mystery disease, inject it into the abdomen of a guinea pig, and then wait for 2 weeks. If the animal developed a fever, that likely meant it had Q fever. Dr. McDade thought Q fever was a long shot, but he agreed with Dr. Sensor that it was important to rule out every possible disease. So he went ahead and started the testing process. And much to his surprise, the guinea pig did come down with a fever, but it came down with it after only 2 days, which meant this disease wasn't Q fever, it was something worse. But when he looked at the samples under the microscope, Dr. McDade saw nothing. Except for a few scattered bacteria, the sample was completely clean. Just to be sure, he repeated the process, testing for other types of bacteria, but nothing showed up. Dr. McDade assumed that whatever was causing the guinea pig's fever was not a bacteria, but figuring out what it really was landed outside of his expertise. And so he passed along his results to Dr. Sensor, hoping someone else could make more sense of it. If they didn't, he wasn't sure how they'd solve the deadly infection. But over the next few weeks, no answer emerged. On August 20th, 1976, so almost 3 weeks after the first cases of this mystery disease were reported, CDC head Dr. Sensor sat in his office in Atlanta. He looked at the inconclusive test results that were spread across his desk. Despite the CDC's best efforts, they weren't any closer to solving this mystery. Dr. Sensor had other teams scour over Dr. McDade's guinea pig's bacteria samples, but nothing out of the ordinary had appeared. David Fraser's samples from the Bellevue Stratford Hotel had also revealed nothing, and they had conducted extensive interviews with patients to check for commonalities, but those interviews had not offered any new clues either. Although they'd been able to rule out certain diseases like typhoid, the plague, and miscellaneous viruses, they were no closer to figuring out what was causing this outbreak. Aside from a few bacteria that naturally occurred in the environment, they had found no evidence of anything unusual. And in the meantime, people kept getting sick. All told, 226 people had been infected by this mystery disease, and the death toll had now climbed to 34. The public was getting more scared by the day. An assistant brought in a stack of newspapers and magazines. Dr. Sensor groaned when he saw the headlines. An article from Time magazine called the disease, quote, the Philadelphia killer, end quote. The CDC's inability to provide an answer to the terrifying illness only fueled people's fears, and some began to turn to conspiracy theories. Dr. Sensor eyed the thick stack of pink messages on his desk. The CDC had been flooded with calls ever since the investigation began. People from all over the country phoned in with questions, tips, and general panic. Some wondered if it was an attack from a foreign adversary. Even the FBI had called. While there was no sign it was an act of bioterrorism, it couldn't be completely ruled out either, and that made people nervous. Dr. Sensor couldn't blame them. But after launching the largest medical field investigation in its history, they had hit a brick wall. There were no more samples to test, either from the hotel or from sick patients. David Fraser's team in Philadelphia had done everything they could to investigate the outbreak. The only silver lining was that the number of people becoming ill had abruptly stopped, which meant this mystery illness was not transmissible from person to person, and so the general population was not in any danger of a massive pandemic. But Dr. Sensor didn't take much comfort from that. Without knowing what was behind this disease, there'd be no way to stop it if it happened again. Still, he was out of ideas. Dr. Sensor let out a deep breath and picked up the phone to call Dr. Fraser. It was now, unfortunately, time to call off the investigation. Five months later, in December of 1976, Joseph McDade, the microbiologist who had conducted the Q fever tests, poured himself a drink at a holiday party in Atlanta. Dr. McDade was ready for the year to end. The past few months had been deeply frustrating. Ever since the investigation had been called off in August, Dr. McDade and his colleagues at the CDC had been under severe scrutiny. The head of the CDC, Dr. David Sensor, had even been accused by Congress of running a sloppy investigation. Public confidence in the health organization was at an all-time low, and Dr. McDade didn't know how they could get anyone to trust them again. As Dr. McDade chatted with some friends, someone tapped him so hard on the shoulder that he almost spilled his drink. Dr. McDade turned around and saw that it was one of his neighbors. The man was red in the face and he was holding a glass of whiskey in his hand, and so Dr. McDade could tell, this guy was drunk. But before he could say anything, the neighbor jabbed Dr. McDade in the chest with his other finger and said he knew Dr. McDade worked for the CDC. Then the neighbor ranted about how badly the CDC had failed the American people, and that people like him, Dr. McDade, were why the Philly killer had claimed so many lives. Dr. McDade took a step back, totally stunned, and then before he could respond, the neighbor had turned and walked away. Dr. McDade turned back around to his friends, but he couldn't focus on the conversation anymore. He wasn't angry at the confrontation. The man had been harsh, but he was right. Dr. McDade felt an overwhelming sense of failure for not being able to help crack the case. For the rest of the week, that feeling of failure stayed with Dr. McDade until he couldn't take it anymore. One day during the week between Christmas and New Year's, Dr. McDade headed to his lab at the CDC. No one else was there. Dr. McDade stood alone in a dark room surrounded by lab tables and microscopes. A string of blinking lights on the ceiling and a half-empty gift basket were the only reminders that it was the holidays. Dr. McDade wanted to look at the tissue samples again from Philadelphia just to kind of clear his conscience and make sure he didn't miss anything. So he pulled out the samples that he'd tested back in August and he slid them one by one under the lens of his microscope. And once again, they were completely clean, except for a few stray bacteria shaped like little rods. Over the summer, he'd assumed these stray bacteria had accidentally gotten mixed into the samples. It was impossible to avoid some level of contamination. Now, Dr. McDade wasn't so sure and wondered if there was more to them. He grabbed a few more slides from deep storage that he hadn't examined before, but they all looked the same. There were just a few rod-shaped bacteria floating around in each sample. But then, Dr. McDade examined one last slide from the lung tissue of a deceased veteran. And when he looked at it, he saw something that shocked him to his core. There weren't just a few of the rod-shaped bacteria. There was a giant cluster of them, far too many to be random contaminants. The answer had been in front of him the entire time. These little rod-shaped bacteria that he had written off had caused the outbreak. But before he could tell anyone, he had to be 100% sure he was right. So Dr. McDade grabbed more slides from the freezer and started running more tests. 2 weeks later, in January of 1977, Dr. Sensor sat in his office, eager to hear what Joseph McDade had apparently discovered during the holiday break. And Dr. McDade would announce that he had identified the actual organism responsible for the outbreak. He described his findings to Dr. Sensor, who was totally stunned. They had tested for every disease they could think of, but even the CDC's top minds could never have guessed it would be something like this. Dr. Sensor agreed that Dr. McDade's discovery was a significant breakthrough, but they needed to gather more samples from the Bellevue Stratford Hotel just to be certain. And so, a few days later, Dr. Sensor sent out one more team of medical detectives to Philadelphia. And during this search, The crew went straight to the roof of the hotel, and there they took a sample from a very specific area. And there, on a cold winter day 6 months after it first started, the mystery was finally solved. The Veterans Convention had taken place in July, a hot and sticky month in Philadelphia. The hotel's cooling system ran full blast for the 3 days of the convention. The cooling towers up on the roof were old and hadn't been maintained recently, allowing the water inside that was used for air conditioning to grow warm and stagnant. It had created the perfect environment for new bacteria to thrive, in a thin coating of slime commonly known as pond scum. Normally, the bacteria in pond scum doesn't make people sick, because people don't inhale it. That's why you can usually swim in lakes, ponds, and other freshwater sources without coming down with this particular deadly disease. It's only deadly if it becomes aerosolized, which means being turned into a spray. And in the summer of 1976, that's exactly what happened. When the hotel's air conditioning system kicked on, the bacteria, which had grown in the cooling tower's warm water, was transported down through the system's pipes. It was then sprayed out as cooled air all over the thousands of veterans inside the hotel. Everyone who inhaled the air at the convention was breathing in bacteria-ridden water droplets. That included people like the bus driver and bank teller who had both died. They hadn't even gone into the hotel, but they had been exposed to the infected mist that had come off the cooling tower and fell onto the sidewalk below. Not everyone who inhaled the mist got sick, including most of the hotel's employees and other guests. This was likely because they were younger or did not have any other health risks that made them more susceptible to this bacteria. Now, nobody knew about this deadly mist because right after the convention, the air conditioning filters at the hotel had been cleaned. That's why the team of EIS investigators didn't find bacteria when they scoured the hotel for samples. But after Joseph McDade's discovery, they finally tested the cooling tank's interior, which had been missed before when they were doing all those samples. In the slime coating on the inside of the tower, they found the deadly bacteria that Dr. McDade had originally seen under his microscope. This bacteria was named Legionella in reference to the convention's attendees, the mostly male veterans who were all members of the American Legion. The condition they developed is now known as Legionnaire's disease, and while there are still occasional outbreaks today, thanks to the efforts of the CDC, Joseph McDade, and even the angry neighbor at the holiday party, this disease is now treatable and much less fatal. But that all came too late for Captain Ray Brennan, the conference attendee who had to retire early from the service because of his heart issues. Surrounded by his 2 brothers and 4 sisters, including Maisie, Ray died just before sunrise on July 27, 1976, holding one of his beloved seashells in his right hand. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but he went down in history as the first of the 29 victims of Legionnaire's disease. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories. We use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Lauren DeLille. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Coordinating producer